So I will start with the introduction of the delegates here. Sarwat Mohiuddin Sahaba is a poet, painter, translator, and prose writer who works in Punjabi, Urdu, and English. She's the author of 9 books. She holds a master's degree in Punjabi literature from Punjab University. She has lectured widely and has represented Pakistan internationally at conferences and seminars, and has been honored with various national and international awards in recognition of her work. Daisy Rockwell is an American painter, writer, and translator. She has translated a number of modern classical works of Hindi and Urdu literature, among them works by Upandranath Ashk's Girti Diwarein, Falling Walls, and Sheher Mein Ghoomta Aina, In the City, A Mirror Wandering, and Khadija Mastoor's novels Angan and Zameen. In 2022, Daisy won the International Booker Prize for the translation of Gitanjali Shree's novel Ret Samadhi, published in English as Tomb of Sand. Nasreen Rehman Sahaba is a historian of emotions and aesthetics and a translator. She has translated Shankar Kaifi's memoir, Yaad Ki Rah Guzar, which was on Times of India bestseller list for a year and was later adapted for stage. She's an activist who believes in the power of the arts to transform societies. The first volume of her 3-volume collection of Manto's short stories will be launched at the LLF. Bilal Tanweer's novel, The Scatterhair is Too Great, won the Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize and was the finalist for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. His translation of Muhammad Khalid Akhtar's novel and stories, Love in Chakiwada and Other Misadventures, received the Pen Translation Fund grant. He's the chair of jury for the 2023 Commonwealth Short Story Prize. So I would like you to give a warm welcome to all of them. So I'll just open with a few questions, and then we'll see where it goes. So my first question to the panel is, how do you choose a work? What appeals to you in that work which prompts you to undertake the very hard labor of translating it? What are the facets of that work? What kind of is it the characters, the story, the structure, the narrative, the kind of languages that's used in it that entices you to do that? So I think it's an open question for the entire panel, and you can start from anywhere. I'll invite Sarwat Mohiuddin Sahaba to answer this first.
Is it on? Okay. Well, it's very satisfying to translate from one language to another, but me being a poet, what attracts me the most is the good poetry. And I have not been translating fiction at all, although I write fiction, but poetry is closer to my heart. And this book, which I'll be talking about, is a translation of the national poet of Hungary, Sándor Petőfi. And it wasn't my choice, actually. The Hungarian ambassador asked me, he said, can I request you something? Can you please translate our national poet into Punjabi? And my first question was, why Punjabi, why not Urdu? So he said, we have had a very, very long connection with Lahore. The foundation stone of the Punjab University, Lahore, was laid by a Hungarian professor, Professor G.W. Leitner, who was also the first principal of the government college. So after that, when he went away, there was another, by the time Allama Iqbal entered university, there was another Hungarian professor who introduced him to Petőfi. So in this book, there is also, Allama Iqbal has paid great tribute to Petőfi, because not only he was just a poet, but he actually is responsible for uh, the whole nation to rise up to get there. You know, by the way, he was only 26 when he died. He wrote his first poem at the age of 21, and he died at 26. So 5 years of poetry, that is what really attracted me, that 5 years of poetry made the whole nation stand up for their freedom, and they got their freedom. So I have translated that. And I'm not a very prolific translator, but I have just translated Heer Waris Shah into English, a poetic translation. Then again, it was the work itself, the poetry itself, which interested me to translate it.
I never realized that the Punjab University was the last remnant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the face of the earth.
Yes.
Daisy, the same question for you.
Okay. Well, what I always say when people ask me why did you choose to translate whichever book, I say, well, I have to fall in love with the book first, but that's not necessarily a clear answer, because what does that mean? And for a translator, I think falling in love with a book means that you start to translate it while you're reading it. The translation starts to occur in your head, and when you put it away and when you put it down and walk away, you're still translating it in your head, and you start to want to tell your friends, or you want to share, you want other people to read it who don't have access to the original text. That's how it works for me. And so it's like if a book starts to just rattle around in my head and I can't let it go, that means that I've fallen in love with it. And, you know, of course I have to add that none of us get paid enough to translate something if we don't fall in love with it. There are other language pairings, like, you know, Spanish to English, where you don't have to fall in love because you'll get a nice big check, I suppose, but that doesn't happen for us.
To put the thing in context, the kind of payment that translators internationally receive. In France, I think French translators get the highest payment, something like $180 to $200 per page, which, I mean, if you are working as a translator, that helps you pay your bills and, you know, continue a semblance of basic life. But in terms of how South Asian translators get paid, they get paid about, if they're very lucky, $500 to $1,000 for the entire book of 500 pages. So something like, you know, $1 or $2 per page. So this is the kind of payment disparity which makes the work of translation so much more difficult for people to undertake.
Can I add, that's why translations from South Asian literature are a strange sort of hodgepodge collection of the passions of a few eccentric people, because we choose our own work too. And if you were doing it from French, you would be asked by publishers and hired by publishers to do certain works, but we choose our own books. So it's all, those of you reading translation, you're dependent entirely on the whims of a few eccentric people.
Nasreen Saba, the same question for you.
First, I'd agree with Daisy. You have to fall in love with the text that you're going to work on. So for me, how did the process of translation begin? I would say from very early life, because I grew up in a bilingual family, and I grew up speaking English and Urdu. And very often as a child, I found myself translating simultaneously, either for my great-grandmother or for other people. So the process of translation was happening all the time, and I think it happens for a lot of us who live in post-colonial societies. We are comfortably bilingual, and we are simultaneously translating. So the first book that I translated, which was Shaukat Kaifi Sahiba's memoir called Yaad Ki Reh Guzar. She's Shabana Azmi's mother, and she was a very accomplished actor. So I heard her reading excerpts from her memoir at a lunch. It was still a work in progress. So I went up to her and I said to her how much I loved it and so on. And about a year later, she phoned me and she said, "Bete, किताब ख़त्म हो गई है, अब इसका तर्जुमा करना है। मैं चाहती हूँ कि तुम तर्जुमा करो।" मैंने कहा कि मैंने तो कभी किसी किताब का तर्जुमा नहीं किया, तो आप क्यों ये चाहती हैं? I've never translated a book, so why do you want me to do it? But of course, I'm not saying I'm not going to do it, okay, because I loved the book when I heard it. And that's how it started. On the Manto, it was a completely different process. I was doing my PhD and I wanted to use Manto as an ethnographer on the cinema. And I couldn't find anything on the lives of the people who worked on the lower rungs of the cinema, the gaffers, the spot boys, etc. So I turned to Manto and I translated 15 stories for my supervisor. Now those were stories that haven't been translated before. So when I gave them to him, he said, "Nasreen, why don't you write an introduction and have them published?" Waited to finish my thesis, long years passed. And then I met a publisher at a dinner and I said, "Look, I have the," he said, "Manto's been done to death, but send me your stories." Because I said to him, "These haven't been translated." And the publisher was a man called David Davidar, who runs LLF book company. And I didn't hear from him for about a month. And then I got an email from him and said, "Nasreen, would you translate all of Manto's short stories?" So I said, "I'm not." I sent him an email back. I said, "I'm not mad, you know." But of course, I was reading Manto, and that's another story. I was reading Manto from the time that I was 13. And I always got stared at shops when, as a young girl, I would go and say, "Manto ki kahaniyan chahiye." And I remember in Urdu Bazaar in Pindi, seeing a volume there, patli si. So I asked the shopkeeper. He said, "Sade kol nahi hai." So I said, "Ki wo dekhiye, wo rakhi hue wahan pe." Unhone kaha, "Nahi, wo hum bech nahi rahe." Because he saw, by that time I was about 15 years old. They didn't sell it to me. Anyway, but with Manto, he remains one of my favorite all-time storytellers. And it's not just that, it's also his language, and it's also the way he tells the story. So, yes, going back to it, you have to love the work.
Bilal, your turn.
Yeah, so you have to love the book, or the person guiding your literary pursuits has to love the book. And in my case, that was Musharraf. So my first translation project was Ibn Safi. I was very young. Musharraf emailed me that there is this publisher who's interested in getting a couple of Ibn Safi books translated. And I needed money, promised me $1,000. I never got those $1,000. And so that was my first project. My second project was also, Musharraf. He said, "Why don't you read this book called Chaki Vada Mein Visal?" And I read it. I said, "Yeah, it's nice." He says, "Why don't you translate it?" So I did. And once I finished translating that book, he said, "Oh, yeah, there are other Chaki Vada stories that are related with the same characters. Why don't you translate those?" And I did. And so that book became, Love in Chaki Vada and Other Misadventures. I told this story earlier on a panel where Mohammad Hanif was present, और उन्होंने कहा कि ये उर्दू के सबसे सादतमंद तर्जुमाकार हैं. So I mean, it might sound fantastic, but that's exactly how it went in my case. But I think that the two qualities I look for in the works that I translate. One is I like works that have a strong voice, that have a presence, and the second quality is humor. All the books that all the stories outside of this, I've translated some Manto's non-fiction. I translated a story by Bilal Minto last year. All of those, one of the things I feel I'm attracted to, perhaps unconsciously, is humor. So that would be another thing.
So I'll start the next round of questions with you. How do you see translation? Do you see that as a mission that you have to translate the certain works that you already have in mind that you would like to translate? For example, with me, it's if I read something, I become very agitated. That if I really like something, I want to be the first one to introduce it to another language, to another readership. Is it like that with you? Do you have a number of projects lined up? And a related question, what has been your most challenging translation project so far?
So as far as the first question is concerned, I think that that's a common experience with anyone. I think that that's one of the definitions of beauty, that it inspires us to create more of the same or from the same. So I think that that's something that is at the very heart of the translation and enterprise as well, that we, inspired by or agitated by, what we have experienced, we kind of want to create more in the same vein, and we want to experience it more deeply. So I think that that's certainly there. And I think that the second part of your question about the projects, I don't have a project lined up, because I'm a creative writer myself. And I started, I undertook this translation project of translating Bilal Minto's stories. I was so slow and he got very upset because, I have my own writing and I was, giving it second priority. And after, I think, year and a half, he got very upset. And then, I said, why I think perhaps another translator would be able to give it more attention than I am. So at present, I don't have, other translation projects as such lined up.
Nasreen Sahaba, any translation? Well, you're continuing your work on the Manto translation, we know that. But what are the typical challenges that you have faced, or particular challenges that you like to discuss?
Firstly, I never work on a project. Long years ago, I was an economist, and that was a project, and I gave it up. So I always have to be passionately involved in what I'm doing. But I'm also a teacher, and that takes up a lot of my time. And when you're working with somebody like Manto and his whole short stories, it's a very profoundly disturbing project. And I won't call it a project, because Manto is a deeply disturbed, dark person who's revealing to us very dark aspects of human existence and of the human condition. And as I told my publisher, when I finish this set of translations, I must have a break, I must come up to breathe and for air. Because to translate, you have to go into the mind of your author to find that voice. And I found it extremely difficult, and especially the resonance with present times, the lynching, the killing, the bloodletting, the loss of humanity, the communal strife that is happening all around us, and the commodification of human beings in present times. It resonates so strongly today that I find it very difficult. And for 3 months after I'd finished this book, which was last year, I didn't touch Manto. And then I went back, but I know that to survive and to remain in a space where I can breathe, because volume 2 has the partition stories, And it's not that Bombay and Pune didn't have the rights, they did. And stories like Moselle, etc., you know, they're deeply disturbing stories. And they hold a mirror up all the time. So.
Daisy, do you have any similar experiences to share as Nasreen Rehman Sahaba? Or were there any aspects of, were there any subjects discussed in Upandranath Ashk or Krishna Sobti or Gitanjali Shavi's works which were disturbing, which affected you in the kind of way they affected Nasreen Rehman Sahaba? And well, you have the other questions to answer as well.
Which are the other questions?
Your present projects and what?
I'm working on many projects, and I always have many irons in the fire because one of the reasons is that when you're translating, you have to get copyright permissions. And you have to get somebody to agree to publish the work, preferably before you've done the entire manuscript. So you don't want to have an entire book sitting there that nobody wants to publish. It's better to have just done a sample. So I have lots of things that I'm juggling. And because copyrights are always a very troubled kind of aspect of translators' lives, we were joking recently that we could make a reality program about translators trying to seek copyright permissions. It may not sound funny to you, but if we started telling you stories, which we won't, because we don't want to risk losing any.
One day we may write about them.
Yes.
An anthology.
So anyway, that because of these things, I try to keep a lot of projects going at once, and I also need a change of pace because something can be dark the way that you describe, like Manto, or something can be very difficult linguistically. And then another thing is kind of a breath of fresh air, so you sort of need a palate cleanser. So sometimes I switch off between projects or go between poetry and prose. Gitanjali Shri was extremely difficult to translate because her writing is very experimental, and she's making up words, and she's using words in unconventional ways, and she's breaking up grammar, so I had to replicate all of that. And it was such an exhausting book to translate. It took me quite a long time that I didn't even translate it all for a while after. I just, the same as you, but it wasn't because I was disturbed, it was because I was just spent, and that's actually the first thing that got me moving again was Azra Abbas's Neend Ki Musafate, which we're going to talk about in a later panel, because it was there was so much flow to her work, and I just instinctually understood how to give it voice, and it was poetry, so it was a change of pace. But I did have an experience like what you're talking about when I translated Bhisham Sani's Tamas, which is, as many people know, a really disturbing work about the partition, and there's really no fun parts of that book. It's just it's all very dark. And there was one particular scene, when all of the women, Sikh women in a village are jumping into a well with the children. And when you're translating, you have to do probably at least 10 drafts of every story or every novel to make sure that it comes out polished. So to read that scene with the well, I never could get over it. It was never, I never became blasé, and it's so painful. I had to just keep reading it again and again and again. So usually I do as Bilal does. I usually try to find work that has a little bit of ha-ha in it, even if it's a dark subject. Like Gitanjali Shri has very dark subjects in her book, but it's full of humor. And that's a sustaining thing that keeps you going.
Thank you. I think there are particular challenges posed by translating living writers because they have their own eccentricities, and translating dead writers whose heirs have their own particular eccentricities. So it's always safe to translate the classics whose heirs and authors are long dead, which was, I think, happily the case with you. So there was no interference from the family or the original author. Please tell us a bit about the translation and.
Well, this was actually my first serious work of translation, because before that I had translated, living in Islamabad, you know, people just would say, you are a poet, please translate. I had translated some Chinese, the ambassador at that time wanted to have his poetry translated into Urdu, so I translated about 5 poems for him. And my work is actually on folklore also. So I did translate some folk songs from Latvia and Sweden. But when I was asked for this, then it was a challenge, because I told the ambassador, I don't know Hungarian, obviously. So how am I going to do it? So he said, we'll give you a book of his poetry in English. So he sent the book, but I said, send me a book on his life also. I want to know who he was. He was born exactly 200 years from now. It was 1823, January, so it's all exactly 200 years. So after I read the book on his life, then I chose about 5 or 6 poems which I liked, which I wanted to translate. But through English, doing it into Punjabi, you know, the idiom changes with every language. But you have to take help from a third language if you don't know the original language. So after selecting those poems, I underlined those special words which I wanted to know what exactly and how were they used in the original. So I asked the ambassador's wife, who was not a poet, a good thing for me because she did not interpret, she just told me the exact. So I invited her, she came a couple of times and we did those, she read out the originals. I wanted to hear the music, the rhythm in the original. And then I asked her about the special words which I wanted to know. Obviously they were totally different from what they were in English. And English and Punjabi idiom is totally different. You can't, I could never have done it from, and I didn't want to. So after that, I let it sort of sink in for a couple of days. And then I recreated them in Punjabi using the Punjabi idiom. For example, if you want, I can read
please,
out.
we'd like to hear
Actually,
an excerpt.
there was one of his poems which he had written on the birth of his son. As I told you, he wrote his first poem at the age of 21. He got married at 24. And he died by the age of 26. But before reading this, let me tell you, when Allama Iqbal was introduced, he was introduced by a later Hungarian professor who had come to teach here at the Punjab University, and he gave him a copy of Petofi's poems. And Allama was so much impressed by this that in his book, Payam-e-Mashriq, he has given tribute to many of world poets and things. So in that he has written for Petofi three, I'll just take it, three couplets in Persian as a tribute to him. So in the beginning of the book, I translated those also into Punjabi. I think I will read that first. In his book, Payam-e-Mashriq, Allama Iqbal says, Nafase dari gulistan, za arus gul sarudi, ba dile game fasudi, za dile game rabudi, tu bahun khesh basti, kafilal ara nigare, tu ba ahe subha gahe, dile hunchara kashudi. Banawai khud gumasti, sukhane tu markade tu, ba zamina baz rafti, ke tu azamina budi. The title of this book is from this. And the translation is like this. Ik pal bagi phulan lai, tu geet khushi de gaye, kuj dilan de dukh vadaye, kuj de dard vandaye, अपने लहू दी मेहंदी लाई सूहे फुल्लां हत्थीं सरगी वेले दिल कलियां दे हावां नाल खिड़ाए अपनी आवाज दे विच गुआचा गीत ने तेरी गोर जो नहीं तरती जाया वर्गे ओ ना तरत समाए because when there was this battle in battle for the Russians had sent their troops to help the Austrians to fight with the Hungarian, and at that moment there was a general named General Ben, and he sort of at a place called Savasgar. I can't pronounce it very properly. There, he stopped those Russian troops and they had a huge battle. And Petofi himself took part in that battle. And that was in 1849. And he was killed during that battle, but nobody ever found him. His body was never found, and nobody knew up till now, with all these modern techniques, nobody knows where his body is. So they think that maybe with those one of those 800 soldiers which were killed and buried there, he might be, but nothing is. So the point is, he does not have a grave anywhere. There is no monument for him. So Allama Iqbal had said that he lives in his poetry, because there is no place, there is no grave, there is no monument, there is no place that people can go there. So that is from where I took the name of this book, Geet Hayati Hoye, that those songs are, he's living through those songs. So talking about the idiom, I was saying that in his poem, when he got married at the age of 24, he had one son, and he was the only son. So he wrote a poem for him. And in that poem, obviously it's all revolutionary, but in his poem he says that I will baptize you myself. I don't need priests to come and baptize you. I will baptize you myself, and I will bathe you in my own tears. So now baptizing is something. How can you translate into Punjabi? You know, because if this is Punjabi, this is for people living in Punjab and people who know Punjabi. And the concept of baptism couldn't be there. So I changed it. I changed to what we have socially. Because here, when a child is born, you say azan in the ear, and then you bathe him. So I'll just read out that.
Please.
It's a long poem, but I'll just read up to here. He says, Mera puttar mainu phadao, main seene dar naal lawa. Meri jindadi vichon pungriya, e boota nawa hai koi, ya apna roop vata ke, main mud ape hi jamya. Mere jeevan rukh di tani, tenu ji aaya nu aakhaं, te mithde geet main apne tere rovan vich ralawa. Here it is, jad tere mukh wal takka, te khushiyan saamb na sakka, कोई लोड़ नहीं मुल्ला दी मैं आपे बांग सुनावा जब तेरे मुख वाल तक्का ते खुशियां सांभ ना सका कोई लोड़ नहीं मुल्ला दी मैं आपे बांग सुनावा ते अखियां विचों किरदे हंजुआं दे नाल नुआवा. So it's a long poem, but I will just read the last stanza. By the way, this book is like a mirror image, because Hungarian is written like this, and I have tried to keep the stanzas the same. So I'll just read the end of this, and he says, कि सुन पुत्तर जिस दिहाड़े मेरा वेला पूरा होवे तू ओथे आन खलोवी जेड़ी जा मैं छड़ के जावा ते अप्पड़ के उस थावी ए गल ना तू भुलावी ए जा नहीं तेरा टिकाना तू होर अगां नू जाना मेरी कबर ते लोकी आवन ते ए गल आख के जावन ए बंदा भावें मोया पर घाटा कोई ना होया थां एदी एदा पुत्तर देस अपने लई खलोया.
Thank you very much. Daisy, I would like to invite you to read your favorite passage, or
Okay.
the one that you feel would be most suitable for.
I've been going to a lot of book events for this book, and many of them with Gitanjali, so we often read together. And she always wants to read the same passage. And my daughter, who's 13, was often in the audience, and she started complaining, and she said, I want to hear a different passage. And so we came up with another one, but then Gitanjali, as soon as my daughter was out of the room, would go back to it. I don't know why it's a huge book with so many interesting things, but I think sometimes we get into these like fixed routines, and she wanted to keep doing it. So this is one that she never let us read, which I think is demonstrates the humor. Also, this is a part of the book where the mother, who for almost 200 pages has been lying in bed and won't get up and won't talk. And then suddenly one day they go into her room and she's disappeared. And it's very shocking because she simply won't even move for all this time. And suddenly she's gone. She's almost 80 years old. And so they kind of go through this comical process of trying to find. The initial shock makes them comical, and they're trying to find the mother. So this is a description of Bade, her son, looking for Ma in the bed where she ought to be. There are umpteen methods for searching for a missing object in a quilt. One searches for a missing person in much the same way. One method is to tap the quilt, twist it like it's dough that's been kneaded, then pat it gently. Here's another. You think, this isn't dough, it's a tent. And you raise and lower the corners furiously and run your hand around inside, trying to grab the missing object or person. And when you don't feel anything, you yourself race in behind your hand, squeezing yourself in this way and sticking your head out that way, and you blink wide-eyed as though emerging from underwater, panting, and your eyes flare and contract like a pair of nostrils. A third, the quilt suddenly seems like a carpet, and you pick up all the bedding and fling it down again as though Ma might fall from it separately, as though she were a grasshopper stuck inside. Then you understand that the hidden item could take on any form and could also change its size, at which point all places and things hold possibilities for you. As the search deepens, the senses grow intemperate. So you imagine her taking the form of a silver toe ring, and you shake out the sheet like a delicate dupatta. You imagine her as a letter and feel beneath the pillow and under the mattress. A kitten! You poke at imaginary bundles here and there on the quilt so it won't slip from your hands and run away. If an elephant, you quickly fling the quilt in the air, then jump away so it won't go mad and attack you. If you imagine her as a firecracker, you light the matches and jump so they don't explode right above you. The limits of the imagination have yet to be discovered. If you cross one limit, another will arise. Every shape takes form in the imagination, and Bade continued his search for Ma in ever new places. He even twisted the cup off the thermos, pulled off the top, and peered inside. He also looked behind the photo of his father and inside the little box of cardamom pods, under the bed, on the windowsill, inside the almirah. He opened the drawers, peeked in the toilet bowl, and each time Sushila's weeping broke out afresh. Where is Mataji? She's not here. But when Sushila picked up the mattress to peek beneath it, he scoffed. Are you mad? No, I just thought, she wept quietly. Thought what? He scolded. That maybe Mataji had wrapped herself up in the quilt by accident, somehow. Or you could put it like this, that none among these was the shape of Mataji, Amma, Maji, elderly Dadi, Granny, Chill, but rather the shapes of the senses taking leave like the flight of a dove. And it can also be said that whatever thing takes the form of a dove is the most imaginative of all, as is the dexterous magician who can twirl his wand and turn wood into a snake or something big into something small and bring the dead alive and bear the prone aloft and render the visible invisible. In other words, everyone was thrown for a loop, and when they'd regained their balance somewhat, still slightly dizzy, they began to examine everything, utterly unaware of the distinction between believable and unbelievable. Someone even knocked on the wall, perhaps because they'd noticed the crack, which looked sort of like a wound, as though it had shrunk in the cold, then split open like a sore. It could have formed a hole through which someone's breath could pass as a thread through the eye of a needle and come out on the other side. Well, frankly, this was all pointless speculation. In a story, you can make whatever you want happen. Otherwise, how could you push a real woman through a crack in the wall like a pail and pick her up on the other side and splash her about?
Rehman Sahaba.
Yes, I don't think I have a favorite passage. I think I have a favorite story, but I'm not going to read from that. It's Moselle, the first story that I heard, the first Manto story that I heard. But I'm going to read from a story which is called Padhiye Kalma. And I've translated it as Recite the Creed. So it's about this man, Abdul, who's a Muslim vendor, and he falls in love with a woman who lives in a chawl called Rukmabai. And she's a temptress, and finally he does what he does. So I'm going to read. Now I was worried. The thought that this ruthless woman was not going to spare my life gave me immeasurable combative strength. I resolved to chop Rukma into bits and stepped out of the cupboard. She was leaning out of the open window and peering at something. I lunged forward, lifted her from her buttocks, and pushed her over and out. All this happened before you could snap your fingers. I heard what sounded like a thud and walked out of the kholi. The whole night I lay on my bed, nursing my injured neck, rubbing oil on it. You can see the marks. I thought nobody would suspect my involvement because Rukma had told her neighbors that she was a sleepwalker. When people discovered her body on the other side of the tenement, they would think she walked out of the window and fell to her death. Finally, it was morning. I tied a handkerchief around my neck to conceal the wounds. Those were the wounds of the rope with which she tried to strangle him. The clock struck 9 and then noon, but there was no talk of Rukma's corpse. I had pushed her out into a narrow alley between two buildings. It has doors on both sides to stop people from entering to urinate and defecate. Mounds of rubbish have accumulated in the alley because inhabitants of both buildings throw their garbage out from their windows. Early every morning, the municipal sweeper opens the door to clear the trash, and she would see Rukma's corpse and raise the alarm. I wanted people to discover this matter sooner rather than later, and wondered what was up. At 2 o'clock, I mustered the courage to open one of the gates to the alley. There was no corpse, and the sweeper had cleared the trash. How very strange. Where was Rukma? I swear on the Quran, I will not be as surprised to escape the gallows as I was at Rukma's disappearance. How did she survive? And the question remains, who took away her corpse? Makes no sense. But sir, for all you know, the witch is alive. In the tenement, people believe that some Muslim either abducted or killed her. May God Almighty bless the man who killed her. But if he has abducted her, you know what that poor fellow's end will be. God help him, sir. Now, sir, please hear what happened to Tukaram. I bumped him precisely 20 days after. I bumped into him precisely 20 days after the Rukma episode. And the chap began to interrogate me. Tell me, where is Rukma? I said, I have no idea. He said, no, you do. I replied, I swear on the Holy Quran, I have no idea. He said, you are lying. You've killed her, and I'm going to file a police report. First, you killed Girdhari and then Rukma. He went off, but sir, I broke into a sweat. I couldn't figure anything out for some time, but finally I came up with a solution to get rid of him. Think about it. What other option did I have? Secretly, I sharpened a knife and set out to find Tukaram. At 6 o'clock that evening, quite by chance, I saw him at the corner of the street by the urinal. He had left a basket of mosammis by the door and gone to urinate. I followed him. He was undoing his dhoti when I called out, "Tukaram?" He turned around to look at me. I had a knife in my hand and thrust it into his stomach. As Tukaram's entrails oozed out, he held them with both hands folded up and fell to the ground. I should have fled the scene, but look at my foolishness. Unsure, I sat down to check his pulse, to confirm that he was dead. I have heard that there is a pulse near the thumb or on the other side, and it took me some time to find it. A constable walked in, unbuttoning his trousers, and I was arrested. That, sir, is the entire story. I recite the creed, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, if I've told a grain of lie.
Thank you. Bilal, if you could kindly read a bit from your work.
Sure. So this is a story about a bakery wala who loves and hero worships novelists. And novelists of a particular variety, novelists who write pulp fiction, mystery novels. And so the excerpt that I'm reading summarizes one of the novels by the writer that he hero worships. Take any novel by Sheikh Qurban Ali Kattar, except for Badmash Hasina. By the end of it, you would not only know everything there is to know about the prevailing norms of the mystery novel, but the plot of 99% of his own novels would have also ingrained itself in your own head, in your head forever. Although he protests if you say it like this, the truth is he has written the same novel over and over again. The elements are exactly the same, only their mix and order are altered. In each one of his new novels, there is the same hero, heroine, and villain, but each time under different names. In the first chapter, you are told about Mr. Manzoor's ailing heart as he beholds a blazing beauty sitting in a horse carriage in the company gardens. How her lethal glances pierced Mr. Manzoor's heart, who is our hero, and how he fell off his bicycle. At exactly that moment, the sound of a motor car startles one of the horses of the carriage and it breaks into a violent dash. Immediately, Mr. Manzoor delays his unconsciousness, grabs his bicycle, and goes in hot pursuit of the carriage. And eventually, after putting his own life at risk, saves the life of the blazing beauty by catching the reins of the horse. At all events, quite often, some accident or the other involving a veiled beauty invariably occurs in the first chapter. Either her horse runs amok, or she stumbles and falls, or seeing that she's alone, some goon sets his mind on filching her wealth. And then the hero begins his passionate love affair by saving her in the first chapter itself. I'm just going to skip to the fourth chapter. The fourth chapter contains all the sensational events. It's not necessary to recount them here. All the aficionados of mystery novels are well aware of them. The masked thug running away with the heroine on the motorcycle, the chase by the hero, and Inspector Shehbaz Khan, the masked thug disappearing and the masked thug disappearing with the heroine into an enormous underground palace located in some ruins, then escape, then pursuit, does, pistols firing, etc., etc.
Thank you very much, Bilal, and all my distinguished panelists. It does not occur to us naturally, but it's true that whatever knowledge we have received from the past has either come through translations or has been influenced by translation. So translations perform a very fundamental function of transferring knowledge, connecting us to our past, as well as curating the present for the future generations. So this is all very important work that all of you are doing, and we hope that there'll be more translators joining this translation movement that seems to be afoot internationally. And thank you all for patiently listening to all of us and being a part of this exercise. Thank you so much.